A Navy SEAL, paralyzed by guilt after a failed mission, returns home a broken man. He finds an unlikely friend in a hungry, terrified stray. A dog haunted by its own dark past. They were two lost souls until the soldier's past came back to hunt him. As the assassin raised his weapon, the stray made a choice and took the bullet meant for the man he loved. Columbus, Ohio, was a city of brick and industry, softened by the green expanse of the suburbs that bled out from its core. In the quiet suburb of Westerville, the air, even in the fading light of evening, was thick and humid with the promise of a Midwest summer storm, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint, sweet perfume of blooming honeysuckle. Mature oak and maple trees, their branches heavy with leaves, formed canopies over streets lined with well-kept houses and manicured lawns, creating tunnels of shadow and soft, dappled light. It was a town of quiet neighborhoods and whispered gossip, where the past was something you read about in a history book, not something that lived and breathed around you. Through this picture of American life, a shadow moved with a silent, practiced grace. It was a German shepherd, a magnificent animal by nature, though its current condition spoke only of hardship. Its name, though no one called it, was Max. It had a large frame, a build made for strength and nobility, now reduced by starvation. Its black and tan coat was matted with burrs and grime, and its ribs showed starkly against its skin with every cautious breath. Its eyes, a deep, intelligent amber, held a weary, penetrating watchfulness that went far beyond the simple caution of a stray. Max navigated the alleys behind the gleaming restaurants and shops of the local town center. He knew the schedules of the kitchen staff, the precise moment a busboy might emerge with a clattering bin of trash. The smells of fried chicken, rich mac and cheese, and seared steaks were a constant torment, a rich tapestry of abundance that was not for him. He survived on what was carelessly discarded, cold, hardened scraps, the crusts of bread, the gristle cut from a roast. He ate quickly, never growling, never fighting, always ready to melt away if an angry human voice was raised. He was a ghost in a town of ghosts, and he had learned the hard way that humans were a danger to be avoided. Sometimes, a shopper, charmed by the beauty of such a dog, would stop. "Oh, look, honey. The poor thing. Here, puppy. Come on." A woman with a bright pink visor and kind, pitying eyes had cooed one afternoon, holding out a piece of her sandwich. Max simply froze, every muscle tensed. The outstretched hand, the soft voice. It was a trap. He couldn't afford kindness. Kindness was the prelude to loss. With a movement almost too fast to follow, he backed into the shadows of a wrought iron gate, leaving the woman standing alone, her offering unreceived. Trust was a currency he had spent, a luxury he could no longer afford. His weariness was not innate. It had been forged in trauma. Most of the time, he could keep the memories at bay, burying them under the daily, urgent needs of hunger and thirst. But the town was full of triggers. That evening, as dusk settled and the streetlights began to flicker on, a car accelerating too quickly from a stop sign let out a sharp, cracking backfire from its exhaust. For Max, the world dissolved. The humid Ohio air vanished, replaced by the sharp, metallic smell of gunpowder and the thick, coppery scent of blood. The asphalt beneath his paws disappeared, replaced by hot, unyielding pavement. There was a sound, a deep and kind voice, a voice that had meant safety and purpose, calling out. Then silence, a flash of blue, the authoritative navy blue of a uniform, the only color in a world that had gone gray, crumpling to the ground. Max staggered, his legs buckling. A low, guttural whine vibrated in his chest. He wasn't in Westerville. He was back in that last, terrible moment. He panted, his heart hammering against his thin ribs, his amber eyes wide with a terror that was months old but as fresh as the humid air. He backed away, bumping hard into a brick wall, the rough texture snapping him back to the present. He was shaking. The car was gone. The shoppers were laughing, oblivious. He was safe, but he was shattered. It took several long minutes for the adrenaline to recede, leaving him weak and trembling. When his legs felt steady enough to hold him, he left the dangerous, open space of the town center. He moved with purpose now, trotting past the grand facades of historic homes, his claws clicking softly on the flagstone sidewalks until he reached the edge of town. His refuge wasn't a house, but a hollow. Beneath the creaking, ancient wooden planks of an old, unused railway bridge, there was a space just high enough to crawl into. It was damp and smelled perpetually of low tide, mud, and salt. But it was dark, defensible, and hidden. From this hollow, he could watch the flow of traffic on the highway without being seen. He watched the massive semi-trucks, mountains of steel, glide silently past. He watched the lights of the distant city skyline sparkle against the darkening sky. He was an observer, never a participant. He curled into the driest patch of dirt, tucking his nose under his tail. He tried to rest, but the backfire had unsettled him, leaving his memories raw. The town grew quiet, the laughter and music fading as the hours passed. Then, the weather turned. The humidity that had been a heavy blanket all day began to thicken, coalescing into something tangible and menacing. The air grew still. The oppressive silence of a world holding its breath. A low, distant rumble vibrated through the ground, felt more than heard. Max lifted his head, his ears flat. The sky, which had been clear and starry, was now blotted out by a roiling mass of clouds that made the night impenetrable. A flash of lightning illuminated the undersides of the clouds, painting them a sickly, bruised purple. Then the first real clap of thunder tore through the sky. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical blow. The deafening crack, echoing across the open fields, was amplified by the confined space under the bridge. For Max, it wasn't thunder. It was gunfire magnified 1,000 times. A fusillade of the trauma that had defined him. The sky was tearing apart just as his world once had. He pressed himself into the damp earth, his powerful body trembling violently. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide. The memory was everywhere. The blue uniform, the smell of blood, the final, terrible stillness of the man who had been his entire world. A pained, agonizing whine escaped his throat, a sound he hadn't made since that day. It wasn't a bark or a growl. It was the sound of a creature that had lost its anchor, its purpose, its pack. It was the sound of absolute loneliness. The heavens opened. The rain began, not as a gentle shower, but as a furious, angry deluge. It hammered on the thick wooden planks of the bridge above him. A deafening drumbeat that matched the frantic rhythm of his heart. The wind howled, driving the rain sideways into his shelter, soaking his already thin coat. Max squeezed his eyes shut, but he couldn't escape the sound. Every clap of thunder was a fresh explosion, a new wave of terror. He whined again, a desperate, broken plea to a world that had taken everything from him. The storm raged over Westerville, lashing the old trees and turning the quaint streets into dark, rushing streams. And under the bridge, a lone dog trembled in the darkness, trapped in the deafening echo of a past he could not escape. The storm that had terrorized Max under the bridge broke just before dawn, leaving the suburb of Westerville washed clean. The humid air felt scoured, fresh with the smell of ozone and damp earth. As the first pale, gray light of morning crept over the horizon, painting the undersides of the remaining clouds in shades of apricot and lavender, the town was still, holding its breath in the post-storm quiet. It was in this gray light that Lieutenant Jake Carter, call sign Reaper, began his day. Jake moved through the quiet streets like a phantom, his feet pounding the wet asphalt in a steady, relentless rhythm. He was a man built of disciplined angles and coiled strength, in his early 30s but with eyes that held the weary, seasoned exhaustion of a man much older. His dark hair was cut short, in precise military fashion, and his frame was lean and purely functional, without a hint of bulk. The wiry, powerful physique of a Navy SEAL. He wore only running shorts and shoes, his chest and arms a roadmap of faded scars, oblivious to the pre-dawn chill. This run was a ritual, a non-negotiable anchor in a life that had come adrift. He ran the same 7-mile loop every morning from his apartment on the edge of town, through the network of suburban streets, and back. It was a penance and a meditation, a way to sweat out the ghosts that clawed at him in the quiet of the night. His apartment, when he returned an hour later, was as sterile as a barracks room. He'd rented it furnished, a high-end unit with a sweeping view of the surrounding woods, but he'd added nothing of his own. No photos, no books, no clutter. A single black duffel bag sat at the foot of his perfectly made bed. His kitchen counter held only a coffee maker, a blender for protein shakes, and a knife block. It was the temporary camp of a man who had no plans to stay, a man who had forgotten how. Jake was on mandatory leave. Benched was the more accurate term. 3 weeks ago, in a dusty, sun-baked alley halfway around the world, his team had walked into a trap. The operation, a high-stakes rescue, had gone wrong in a dozen different ways at once. Jake, the point man, the Reaper who was supposed to see everything, had missed the trigger. The explosion had been catastrophic. He still heard it. He still saw it. He saw Miller, the youngest member of his team, the kid he was supposed to be mentoring, go down in a cloud of dust and shrapnel. Miller hadn't died, but his career had. The guilt was a physical weight, a sour knot in his gut that no amount of running could burn away. His commander, a man Jake respected more than anyone, had been blunt. "You're no good to me like this, Reaper," Commander Thompson had said, his voice a low gravel. "You're here, but you're not here. You're running on fumes and anger. Go home. Get your head straight. That's an order." Home was this empty apartment in Ohio, a town he'd barely visited since he was a kid. Getting his head straight meant mandatory twice-a-week appointments with a civilian therapist. By 10 a.m., Jake was showered, dressed in nondescript jeans and a gray t-shirt, and sitting in the quiet, tasteful waiting room of Dr. Ben Jacobs. The office was in a beautifully restored historic house in the town center, filled with antique furniture, thick bookshelves, and the smell of lemon oil and old paper. Dr. Jacobs emerged, a man in his late 60s with a kind, round face, a halo of thinning white hair, and exceptionally sharp eyes. He wore a simple cardigan and slacks, looking more like a favorite college professor than a psychiatrist. "Jake, good to see you," Dr. Jacobs said, his voice calm. Jake nodded, following him into the office. He took the leather chair, though he only sat on the edge, his back straight, hands on his knees. He looked like a man ready for action, not a patient ready to talk. "How was your week, son?" Dr. Jacobs asked, settling into his comfortable armchair. "Fine, sir. Productive. My run times are improving." "Drive," Jacobs steepled his fingers, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "And your sleep?" 4 hours uninterrupted. Mission standard. "This isn't a mission, Jake. This is your life. Tell me about the nightmares." "No nightmares, sir. Just processing. My mind is working through tactical scenarios. It's normal." "Is that what you call it when you wake up and check the locks 3 times? Dr. Jacobs asked gently. Jake's jaw tightened. "You're disconnected, Jake. From this town, from your own life. You're treating Westerville like a forward operating base. When was the last time you just sat, ate a meal you actually tasted, talked to someone who wasn't me?" Jake's frustration, always simmering just below the surface, began to rise. "With all due respect, sir, I'm not here to connect. I'm here to get cleared for duty. My team needs me. Miller is in a hospital in Germany because I wasn't fast enough. Sitting on a park bench smelling the roses isn't going to fix that. I need to get back." "You," Dr. Jacobs said, leaning forward, his kind eyes suddenly hard, "are a soldier with no war to fight, and it is eating you alive. You feel guilty for being the one who walked away. Survivor's guilt is a heavier burden than any rucksack. Lieutenant, you can't outrun it." The session ended, as it always did, in a stalemate. Jake left the office feeling agitated, the doctor's words picking at the raw edges of his soul. He didn't want to feel. He wanted to act. Guilt was a fire, and the only way he knew to control it was to move. Push his body to its limits, until he was too exhausted to think. He bypassed his apartment and went straight back to the running trail, the midday sun now high and hot. The air was thick again. He didn't warm up. He just started running hard. His pace was punishing, a full-out sprint. He dodged joggers and baby strollers. His face was a mask of grim determination. He ran along the paved path by the old railway bridge, where, unbeknownst to him, a pair of amber eyes had watched him pass before retreating into the shadows. He kept going, pushing past the burning in his lungs. He was so focused on his internal battle that he paid no attention to the traffic on the adjacent road. A beat-up sedan, trailing blue smoke, accelerated to pass a slow-moving minivan. As it drew parallel with Jake, its engine gave a loud, metallic backfire. The sound was a gunshot. Close. Unmistakably a gunshot. Jake's mind didn't process. His body simply reacted. In less than a second, the disciplined lieutenant vanished and the Reaper took over. He dropped from a full sprint, his shoulder hitting the pavement as he tucked into a combat roll. He came up on one knee behind a thick, colonial-style park bench, the only solid cover available. His right hand instinctively went to his hip for a sidearm that wasn't there. His eyes scanned the surroundings, his heart rate steady, his breathing controlled. He registered everything: escape routes, potential threats, civilian density. He was assessing the kill zone. The entire sequence took maybe 2 seconds. The sedan sped off, its occupants laughing, oblivious. The sound, of course, had just been a backfire. There was no threat. No enemy. Just him, crouched behind a bench in Westerville while a dozen tourists stared at him. A woman gasped, pulling her young son closer. An old man dropped his ice cream cone. Silence. Slowly, Jake Carter stood up. He brushed the grit from his palms and his shoulder. The adrenaline drained away in an instant, replaced by a cold, hollow wave of shame. He wasn't in Kandahar. He was on a jogging path. He wasn't a soldier under fire. He was a spectacle. He saw the fear in the eyes of the people watching him. They weren't looking at a man. They were looking at something broken and dangerous. Dr. Jacobs's words echoed in his head, a soldier with no war to fight. Without making eye contact with anyone, Jake clenched his fists, his knuckles white, forced himself into a rigid, upright posture, and began to walk, not run, back to the sterile emptiness of his apartment. The feeling of being disconnected, a ghost in his own life, was now absolute. The incident with the backfire left a bitter, metallic taste in Jake's mouth. 3 days had passed, and the shame had settled in him like a physical weight, cold and heavy in his stomach. Dr. Jacobs's words, once just an annoyance, now felt like a judgment, a soldier with no war to fight. The doctor was right, and Jake hated him for it. His rigid morning schedule felt like a lie. The run times he'd been so proud of now seemed pathetic, a child's attempt to prove he was still in control. So he broke his own rules. It was 4 p.m., the worst possible time to run in Ohio. The air was a suffocating, wet blanket of heat, the sun a relentless white disk in the sky. The town's famous charm had been baked away. Tourists huddled inside air-conditioned shops. This was what he wanted. He wanted the punishment, the heat searing his lungs, the sweat stinging his eyes. If he couldn't have the discipline of war, he'd have the penance of pain. He ran faster than he needed to, his feet pounding the flagstones, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wasn't running to anything. He was running from the man who had crouched, terrified, behind a park bench. He turned off the main riverfront path, ducking into a narrow, shaded alley that ran between 2 historic shipping warehouses. It was a shortcut he rarely took. A tunnel of old brick that smelled of stale beer, river water, and garbage. Halfway down, he heard it. A shatter of glass on brick followed by coarse, drunken laughter. Look at him. He's trapped. Come on, boy. Dance for us. Jake stopped. His run, his self-loathing, it all dissolved. He went completely cold, utterly still. His hearing sharpened. He heard a low, desperate growl, a sound more of pure fear than aggression. He moved forward, silent. At the end of the alley, where it dead-ended at a high brick wall, the scene was laid out. A large German shepherd was pressed into the corner, its back against the bricks. It was gaunt, its fur matted and filthy, but it was holding its ground, its teeth bared. It was trembling, its amber eyes wide with terror. Blocking the only escape were 3 young men in their early 20s. They wore the casual uniform of rich college kids, polo shirts, boat shoes, and sunglasses pushed back on their heads. Their faces were flushed with day drinking and cruel excitement. The ringleader, a tall kid with a smug, entitled face, held a green beer bottle by the neck. This was Chad, a name that suited his arrogant posture. He was the one talking. "What's the matter, mutt, scared?" He feigned a throw. His 2 companions, follower 1 and follower 2, stood slightly behind him, laughing nervously. One of them was filming the whole thing with his phone. The dog, it was Max, saw the raised arm and flinched violently, a whine escaping its throat. "Hey!" The word wasn't loud. It was low, flat, and cold. It cut through the humid air like a shard of ice. The 3 young men froze. They turned, squinting into the alley's shadows. Jake hadn't run at them. He hadn't yelled. He had simply closed the distance, moving with the silence of a predator. He now stood 10 feet away, a solid, unmoving silhouette against the bright glare of the street he'd just left. Chad's confidence wavered for only a second. "What do you want, old man? This is private property." Jake didn't answer. He didn't look at the phone. He didn't look at the followers. He just looked at Chad. This was the Reaper. This was the state his commander had warned him about, a place of absolute, cold focus. His gaze wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was, far worse, an assessment. It was the look of a man who could see every vulnerability, every weak point. It was the look of a man who had seen real violence and found this little display pathetic. He took one slow, deliberate step forward. The change in the alley's atmosphere was immediate. The humidity was gone, replaced by a sudden Arctic chill. The follower with the phone lowered it. His nervous laughter died in his throat. Chad, man, let's go." Chad, to his credit, tried to hold his ground. "Yeah. Or what?" Jake took another step. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't change his expression. He simply let the young man see what was in his eyes. He let him see the cold, empty void of a man with no war to fight, and who was, perhaps for just a second, looking for one. The young man's face went pale. The drunken flush was gone. He was suddenly, terribly sober. He looked at the bottle in his hand, then at the man in front of him, and he understood. He was holding a toy. He was facing a weapon. "Whatever," Chad mumbled, his voice cracking. He dropped the bottle, which rolled to a stop on the cobblestones. He pushed past his friends. This place stinks anyway. The three of them scrambled out of the alley, nearly tripping over each other in their haste to get away. Silence descended, thick and heavy. The only sound was the dog's terrified, ragged panting. Jake let the Reaper persona recede. The coldness faded, and the man, Jake, was left, his heart thudding uncomfortably. He shifted his attention to the dog. Max was still pressed into the corner, teeth bared, its body trembling so badly Jake could see it. It was starved, terrified, and cornered. The perfect victim. "Easy," Jake said, his voice rough. He consciously relaxed his jaw. He didn't move closer. He saw the dog's eyes, the intelligence there, not just the fear. He saw a creature that had been betrayed by the world, just as he felt he had been. Slowly, as if signaling to a sentry, Jake raised his hands, palms open and empty, and held them by his shoulders. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's growl subsided, but the fear remained. Jake recognized that look. It was the haunted, trapped terror he'd seen in his own eyes in the mirror that morning. It was the look of a survivor who was one more bad moment away from breaking completely. He thought of Dr. Jacobs. Connect with something. Slowly, carefully, Jake lowered himself to one knee, wincing as his muscles protested. The gesture was deliberate, making himself smaller, less threatening. He unzipped the small running pouch at his waist and took out his emergency protein bar, peanut butter and oats. He tore the wrapper, his eyes never leaving the dog. He broke the bar in half. He placed one half on the dirty cobblestones 6 feet in front of him. "I know what it's like to be cornered," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. Max stopped growling. It stared at the man, then at the protein bar. Its wet black nose twitched. The rich smell of peanut butter cut through the alley's stench. Hunger was a powerful motivator, but its terror was deeper. It was at war with itself. Jake didn't move. He didn't coax or coo. He just waited. He knew this game. He knew what it cost to take that first step toward trusting anything again. After a long, agonizing minute, Max took a hesitant step forward, then another. Its paws made no sound. It was a shadow detaching itself from the wall. It reached the protein bar, snatched it with a lightning-fast snap of its jaws, and retreated in a single bound back to its corner. It ate it in 2 quick chomps, its eyes never leaving Jake. Jake remained on one knee. He held up the other half of the protein bar. This time, he didn't put it down. He just held it, his palm flat. This was the real test. Max stared at the offering. It looked at the man's hand, a hand not raised to strike. It looked at the man's eyes, which were not cruel or mocking, but steady and patient. It took another step, and another. It crossed the alley, every muscle in its body coiled to spring back. It stopped just out of reach. It stretched its neck forward, its nose twitching, and with a delicacy that was astounding in such a large, starved animal, it took the other half of the bar from Jake's hand. Its rough tongue grazed Jake's skin. The contact was electric, a jolt, sharp and clear. Max didn't retreat this time. It just stood there eating, watching. The terror in its eyes hadn't vanished, but something else had joined it. A spark of deep, intelligent curiosity. Jake stayed perfectly still until the dog was finished. Then, moving with painful slowness, he rose to his feet. "Okay," he said softly. He turned his back on the dog, a calculated risk, a sign of trust, and walked slowly out of the alley, back into the blistering, bright heat of the Westerville afternoon. He felt the dog's eyes on his back every step of the way. He didn't look back. The next morning, Jake's biological clock woke him at 4:45, as always. The encounter in the alley was vivid in his mind, the fear in the dog's eyes, the jolt of its tongue on his palm. It was the first thing he'd felt in weeks that wasn't anger, guilt, or shame. It was connection, a fragile thread. He dismissed it. It was a dog, a stray. He had his own problems. He dressed, got his water, and stepped out into the humid, pre-dawn dark. His ritual was essential. He started running. He made it 2 blocks before he felt it. The instinct was primal, drilled into him by years of operating in hostile territory. A sixth sense told him with absolute certainty he was being followed. He didn't stop. He didn't turn his head. He simply kept running, but his senses exploded outwards. He listened to the echo of his own footfalls on the cobblestones. Thump, thump, thump. And behind him, faint but precise, another sound. Click, click, click. The sound of claws on stone. He maintained his pace. The follower was good. It matched his speed, keeping a consistent distance. When Jake picked up the pace slightly, the clicking accelerated. When he slowed, so did it. He reached Forsyth Park, its iconic fountain still and silent in the dark. He looped around the perimeter, his eyes scanning, and he saw it. About 50 yards back, moving in the deep shadows under the oak trees, was the German Shepherd, Max. The dog was a ghost, fluid and silent. When Jake turned his head, the dog froze, blending into the mottled darkness, becoming just another shape in the shadows. Jake turned back and kept running. A strange, uninvited feeling settled in his chest. It wasn't annoyance. It wasn't fear. It was something else. He had a shadow. The 7-mile run continued. The dog never got closer. It never fell behind. It was a silent, 4-legged escort, a sentry matching his pace. When Jake finally reached the entrance to his apartment building, he stopped and turned. 50 yards away, at the street corner, Max stopped too. It sat, perfectly framed by a flickering gas lamp. They looked at each other across the distance. Jake gave a single, sharp nod, almost a salute. Then he went inside. The next morning, Jake's routine had changed. He packed his usual water bottle. He also packed a collapsible nylon water bowl and a second, larger bottle of water. He tucked 2 beef jerky sticks, his own private stash, into his running pouch. He stepped outside. He didn't have to wait long. As he hit the first corner, the soft click, click, click fell into rhythm behind him. Halfway through his run in the park, Jake stopped. He poured water into the collapsible bowl and set it on the grass. He laid one of the jerky sticks beside it. Then he backed away 30 feet and began his stretching routine, his back mostly turned to the dog. He heard the cautious approach, the sniffing, the rapid lapping of water, the crunch of jerky. He didn't turn around. When he was done, he glanced back. The bowl was empty. The dog was gone. Vanished back into the shadows. Jake packed up the bowl and kept running. This became their new ritual. For 10 days, they ran together, but apart. Jake would leave the offering. Max would accept it. The distance began to close. 50 yards became 40. Max no longer vanished completely, but would retreat to a respectful distance and wait for Jake to finish his stretches. The dog was getting stronger. Its coat, though still matted, seemed to have more life. Its frame, while still thin, was no longer skeletal. It ran with an easy, powerful gait, and Jake was changing, too. He slept a little better. The hard edges of his anger felt softer. He had a purpose, however small. He had to get up. He had to run. His shadow was waiting. He found himself in Dr. Jacobs's office, sitting on the edge of the sofa as usual. "You seem different today, Jake," Dr. Jacobs said, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "Your shoulders are less rigid. You're not watching my clock." Jake grunted. "The running is helping." "Is that all it is?" Dr. Jacobs prompted gently. "You seem more present, as if you've found something to focus on here in Westerville besides your own thoughts." Jake almost told him. He almost said, "There's this dog." He thought of the amber eyes, the silent loyalty, the shared understanding of being a survivor. But to say it out loud felt like a betrayal. It felt like turning something real into a medical symptom. A line item in his PTSD recovery file. "I'm just sticking to the program, sir," Jake said, his walls snapping back into place. Dr. Jacobs sighed softly. "Very well, Lieutenant." That night, the progress Jake had made was shattered. He fell asleep around 11, his apartment silent, the only sound the hum of the air conditioner. He hadn't realized, couldn't have known, that his shadow had followed him all the way home. Max had found the cool marble lobby of the apartment building. It was quiet, safe, and close to the man who brought jerky and water. It lay down outside Jake's door, apartment 4B, invisible to the world. At 02:17, the dream found Jake. He wasn't in Westerville. He was back in the alley. The air was dry, choking with dust and the smell of sulfur and hot metal. It was so real. He could feel the grit in his teeth. "Miller, behind you," he heard himself yell, but the words were thick, slow. "Reaper, I'm pinned." It was Miller's voice. The kid was only 22. Then the sound, the world-ending crack of the second eyed, the one Jake was supposed to have seen, the one that was his fault. The blast threw him. He saw Miller's body, unnaturally still. He saw the dust, the fire. He was choking. He couldn't breathe. Guilt, black and absolute, consumed him. "Miller." Jake screamed the name out loud. A raw, choked sound of pure agony. He thrashed in his bed, tangled in the sheets, his eyes squeezed shut. "No, no, no, no." Out in the hall, Max shot up from a light doze, instantly alert. The sound, the man, his provider. He was in pain. Max was on his feet. The muffled shout from inside the apartment was a sound of profound distress. A sound that cut through all the dog's own trauma and triggered a deeper, more powerful instinct to protect his pack. He pushed his nose against the crack under the door, whining. He could smell the sharp, acrid scent of adrenaline-laced sweat. The man was terrified. "Miller, get up. Get up." Jake yelled again in his sleep. That was enough. Max scratched at the door, his claws scoring the wood. Not enough. He let out a sharp, anxious bark. Not a growl, not an alarm. It was a bark of urgent concern. "Wake up. I'm here." Jake's eyes snapped open. He was in his apartment. He was drenched in sweat, his heart hammering like it was going to break out of his chest. The sheets were twisted around his legs like ropes. The dream clung to him, a toxic film. Threat. His hand went to the nightstand, his fingers closing on the cold steel of the handgun he kept there. He was out of bed in a second, moving into a low crouch, weapon pointed at the door. He heard the scratching. He heard the bark. He froze. He listened, his SEAL training filtering the sounds. It wasn't the deep, guttural bark of an attacked dog. It wasn't the frantic sounds of a break-in. It was a high, anxious bark interspersed with a low whine. It was concern. Slowly, his heart still pounding, Jake lowered the handgun. He placed it on the kitchen counter. He was shaking, not from the dream, but from the realization. He walked to the door and looked through the peephole. A distorted amber eye stared back, wild with worry. He saw Max pacing, whining, scratching the door again. Jake undid the deadbolt. He turned the handle. He opened the door. Max instantly stopped barking. It stood 2 feet away, panting, its whole body vibrating with tension. It looked at Jake, then into the dark apartment behind him, then back at Jake. Jake didn't speak. He was empty, hollowed out by the nightmare. He just stepped back, leaving the door open. An invitation. This was the test. Max had to cross the threshold, a line the dog had never dared to cross. It looked into the dark room, then at the man. Jake's posture was open. He wasn't a threat. He was the man with the jerky and the kind, patient eyes. He was the man who was in pain. Max took a step, then another, and crossed the threshold into the apartment. Jake quietly closed and locked the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was loud in the silence. He was too tired to process what he'd just done. He walked back to his mangled bed and sat on the edge, burying his face in his hands, trying to force the images of the dream from his mind. He felt a sudden, gentle pressure on his knee. He looked down. Max was standing beside him, pressing its head firmly against Jake's leg. The dog whined once, softly. Jake stared at it. Then, hesitantly, he raised a hand and placed it on the dog's head. The fur was coarse, but the gesture felt right. He left his hand there. After a long moment, Max sighed, a deep huff of air. It moved away from the bed, walked to the space between the bed and the door, and circled once. Then it lay down, its back to Jake, its head on its paws, facing the entrance, a silent, self-appointed guardian. Jake watched the dog's ribs rise and fall. He watched the steady, calm breathing. The apartment was no longer empty. The sterile, silent room was alive. He lay back on the bed, not bothering to fix the sheets. He stared at the ceiling, his hands still tingling. He listened to the dog's steady, quiet breathing. It was the most peaceful sound he'd ever heard. The guilt was still there. The image of Miller was still there, but they weren't screaming in his head anymore. They were muffled, held at bay by the simple, living presence in the room. Jake closed his eyes. For the first time in months, he didn't fight sleep. He let it come. And for the first time in months, the nightmares didn't follow. Jake woke to silence. Not the sterile, empty silence of the apartment, but a living, breathing quiet. He opened his eyes. The first light of dawn was just starting to creep in. He was on his bed, still in his running shorts, the sheets still a wreck. He turned his head. In the space between the bed and the door, Max lay exactly as he'd fallen asleep, a silent, four-legged guardian. As Jake moved, the dog's head came up, its ears swiveling. It didn't bark or jump. It just watched, its amber eyes clear and intelligent. The nightmare was gone, its toxic residue scrubbed clean by the dog's presence. "Morning, Shadow," Jake mumbled, his voice hoarse from sleep. Max thumped his tail once on the floor. A new reality set in. The apartment, Jake's sterile decompression chamber, now contained a 70-pound, underfed, and very dirty German Shepherd. This required logistics, not emotion. Logistics Jake could handle. That morning, the run was postponed. Jake's first stop was a 24-hour convenience store. He bought 2 cans of the meatiest dog food they had, a gallon of water, and a cheap plastic bowl. He returned and set them on his pristine kitchen floor. Max approached the food with a heart-wrenching dignity. It didn't wolf it down. It ate quickly, neatly, then drank an entire bowl of water. When it was done, it looked at Jake, then walked to the apartment door and sat, staring at the handle. "Right," Jake said. "Got it." Their walk was a slow, functional patrol. The dog was still weak. But the most pressing issue, Jake decided, was the filth. The dog smelled of the river, of garbage, and of fear. He spent the next hour in a tense, silent negotiation, coaxing Max into his walk-in shower. It cost him the rest of his beef jerky. It was a slow, painstaking process. Max trembled, terrified of the confined space and the hissing water, but it never snapped. It just endured, its eyes squeezed shut. Jake was gentle, his hands, calloused and scarred from weapons and hardship, now working shampoo into the matted fur. He found 3 old scars under the grime, and a spot on its left hip that was still tender. As he rinsed the soap away, the water running brown down the drain, he saw the dog underneath. It was magnificent. Its black and tan coat, though thin, was rich. Its frame was noble. This was not a dog born to the streets. This was a dog that had lost everything. "There," Jake said, tossing it a towel, which Max stared at, confused. "At least you're clean." The rest of the day was spent on a new kind of mission. He bought a proper leash, a thick collar, a real bed, and the most expensive 50-pound bag of dog food the pet store sold. He felt a strange, quiet satisfaction in the simple, physical act of providing. He was, for the first time, taking care of something other than himself. In the afternoon, while Max dozed on his new bed, Jake sat on his balcony. He was cleaning his sidearm, a ritual he performed every 3 days. He was halfway through reassembling the slide when his secure laptop, the one he was required to check daily, pinged. It was a flagged email from Commander Thompson. The message was simple and cold: Intel updated. Broken chain op target, Kane, is not overseas. He's CONUS. High probability of retaliatory action against team assets. Maintain full situational awareness. Go dark. Jake felt his blood run cold. CONUS, Continental United States. Team assets, that meant him. Victor Kane. The name tasted like ash. Kane wasn't a warlord or a terrorist. He was a creature of civilized decay, a ghost who ran the largest human trafficking network on the East Coast from the comfort of a penthouse suite. He was charming, intelligent, and utterly without a soul. He wore bespoke suits, quoted classic literature, and treated human beings like disposable commodities. The failed mission, Broken Chain, had been Jake's obsession. They had been so close. They'd raided Kane's main shipping hub, not in some foreign port, but in Baltimore. They'd freed more than 50 people. But Kane, tipped off by an insider, had vanished. The eye that had crippled Miller hadn't been a booby trap. It had been a parting gift, a message, and it was Jake's fault. He'd pushed the intel. He'd guaranteed the target was secure. Kane wasn't just a failed mission. He was a personal failure. And now he was here. Jake looked out at the city of Westerville, at the peaceful, tree-lined streets and the slow-moving river. The entire landscape, once just a dull backdrop, now seemed menacing. Every shadow was a threat. Every tourist was a potential spotter. He looked back inside the apartment. Max was awake, sitting up on his bed, staring at him. He hadn't heard the ping, but he'd felt the change in the room. He sensed the man's sudden, absolute tension. "It's nothing," Jake said, his voice hard. "Just bad news." Max let out a low, almost inaudible growl. For the next few days, Jake's routine was a mask for his heightened state of alert. He and Max took walks, no longer casual strolls, but structured patrols. Jake's eyes constantly scanned rooftops, parked cars, faces in the crowd. But he wasn't the only one on watch. Max, now clean, fed, and bonded, was transformed. The terrified stray was gone. In its place was a guardian. It walked with its head high, its ears constantly twitching, scenting the air. Its protective instincts, once buried by trauma, were now fully engaged, and they were all focused on Jake. On Tuesday, a gardener's truck was parked across from their building all day. The man inside, wearing a stained orange vest, never got out. He was just watching. Jake had noted him, but Max hated him. Every time they passed the truck, a low, rumbling growl would start deep in the dog's chest. The hackles on its neck would rise. "Easy, boy," Jake would murmur, pulling the leash tight. "I see him." On Wednesday, a man in a polo shirt carrying a clipboard and claiming to be checking meters tried to follow them into the elevator. Max moved instantly and silently, placing his body between the man and Jake, his lip curling just enough to show teeth. The man, Mr. Clipboard, stammered an apology and backed away. Jake realized with a jolt that the dog was a more reliable alarm system than his own paranoia. Max wasn't just reacting to people. It was reacting to intent. The city was no longer safe. Jake had to move. He had to get them both out of Westerville. On Thursday afternoon, he decided on one last walk through Forsyth Park to clear his head and plan his exfiltration. The park was crowded. The sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows. Max was on high alert, his head constantly swiveling. Jake felt it before he saw it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The ambient noise of the park seemed to dip for just a second. A black sedan, a late-model Mercedes with windows so dark they looked like polished obsidian, was gliding along the park's perimeter road. It was moving too slowly, out of sync with the tourist traffic. Max stopped walking. It planted its feet and the low, deep-chested growl started again, more menacing than Jake had ever heard it. Jake's hand went instinctively to the holstered pistol at the small of his back. He moved, putting himself between Max and the car. The car stopped. It was directly parallel to them, 20 yards away. The rear passenger window slid down. Jake's heart seemed to stop. It was him, Victor Kane. He wasn't the bruised fugitive Jake had imagined. He was immaculate, dressed in a tailored dark suit and a silver tie. His dark, wavy hair was perfect. He looked like he was on his way to the opera, not hunting a man. His face, handsome and unlined, was calm. Kane looked at Jake. He looked at Max. And then he smiled. It was a slow, easy smile, full of amusement and absolute confidence. It was the smile of a king who had just found a pawn out of position. Victor Kane looked directly into Jake's eyes. He said nothing. He simply raised his right hand, extended 2 fingers, and gave a friendly, casual wave. Then the window slid slowly back up. The sedan accelerated smoothly and silently and vanished into the traffic. The threat was delivered. It wasn't an attack. It was a promise. I see you. I found you. And I can touch you whenever I want. Jake stood frozen on the sidewalk, the blood roaring in his ears. The war he had been so desperate to get back to. It had just found him, and it had found him on his home turf, standing next to the only living thing he had allowed himself to care about. The casual, 2-fingered wave from Victor Kane wasn't a threat. It was a death sentence. The moment the Mercedes turned the corner, Jake's world went cold and hard. The fog of his leave, the therapy sessions, the self-pity, it all burned away. He wasn't a patient anymore. He was a compromised asset, and he had a non-combatant to protect. He gripped the leash. Max, home. Now. His voice was flat, the command absolute. Max, sensing the terrifying shift in his owner, needed no encouragement. He matched Jake's pace, a fast, tactical walk, his head high, ears swiveling. Back in the sterile apartment, the illusion of safety was gone. It was a glass box, a trap. Jake moved with practiced, economical speed. He was the Reaper now. He pulled his go bag from the closet. He loaded it, a burner phone, his secure laptop, a medical kit, 2 spare magazines for his pistol, and all the cash he had in the apartment. Nothing else mattered. His priority was Max. He couldn't take the dog with him when he went dark. He needed a safe place for it, and he needed it 10 minutes ago. He grabbed his personal phone and made a call he'd sworn he'd never make from a compromised location. He called his commander, Commander Thompson. It was a secure line, but he knew the call itself was a risk. Thompson, a man of few words and a voice like gravel, picked up on the first ring. Carter. Reaper, sir, my position is compromised. Target Kane made personal contact 30 minutes ago. A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Son, you need to. Sir, I have a non-human companion. A canine. It's a civilian. Jake's voice was tight, the professional mask cracking. It's clean, but it's with me. I can't go dark with it. I need a safe kennel, somewhere they won't look. There was a pause. Thompson processed the unprofessional, emotional request from his most cold-blooded operator. Understood, he said finally. The single word carried a weight of understanding. 20 miles south of you, Oak Haven Breeders. It's a retired EOD handler named Sam. He's good. I'll make the call. Get it there. Then you disappear, Reaper. Understood? Understood, sir. Jake hung up. Okay. He knew the type. Safe. "All right, boy," he said, clipping the leash to Max's new collar. "Let's go." He didn't take the elevator. He took the fire stairs, his pistol already drawn, Max moving silently beside him. He checked each landing before descending. The building was clear. He emerged into the lobby, scanning the street. Quiet, too quiet. His truck was in the parking garage across the street. To get to it, he had to cross the service alley that ran between the buildings, the same alley where he'd first met Max. The evening air was thick and humid, the sky a deep, bruised purple. The gas lamps were just beginning to flicker on, casting long, distorted shadows. Jake held the pistol low, against his leg. "Heel," he commanded. Max didn't heel. The dog went rigid, its body low. A growl started deep in its chest. It was staring at the black mouth of the alley. "I see it," Jake whispered. He felt it too. A pocket of dead air, a space where the city sounds didn't penetrate. They reached the mouth of the alley, and from the deepest shadows, two men stepped out, blocking their path. They weren't thugs. They were professionals. The first man, the suit, was thin, in his 40s, with a calm, almost bored expression. He wore a dark, well-tailored suit despite the humidity. He looked like an accountant. The second man, the muscle, was big, his jacket bulging. He was the one holding a pistol fitted with a suppressor. He fanned out to Jake's left, a classic flanking maneuver. "Lieutenant Carter," the suit said, his voice polite, conversational. "Mr. Kane sends his deepest regrets. He really does. He finds this just as unpleasant, a waste of your talents." Jake's heart was a block of ice, outnumbered, flanked, and he had a civilian with him. "Max, back!" Jake snapped, pushing the dog behind his leg. He brought his own weapon up, leveling it at the man with the gun. "You don't want to do this." The suit sighed. "He's right, you know. You really don't." The muscle didn't wait. He raised his suppressed pistol. His movement was fluid, practiced. Jake's training took over. He wasn't going to win. He was going to react. He dove right, toward a stack of old pallets, intending to draw fire to create an opening. But the sound of the suppressed shot was a wet, dry cough. Jake felt no impact. He hit the ground hard on his shoulder, rolling, bringing his weapon up. He heard a sound that would haunt his nightmares forever. A high, sharp cry of pain. He looked back. Max wasn't behind him. The dog hadn't obeyed the command. The instant the muscle had raised his weapon, Max had done something Jake's training could never have predicted. It hadn't attacked. It had shielded. It had launched itself forward, leaping in front of Jake, its body intercepting the round aimed at Jake's chest. The dog lay on the cobblestones. Its legs kicking. A dark, spreading stain wet its shoulder and hip. It looked at Jake, its amber eyes wide with shock and pain, and it whined. The world went red. The cold, calculating reaper vanished, incinerated by a pure, primal wave of rage. The man who had felt nothing for months now felt everything. "No!" Jake roared. The sound wasn't a word. It was an explosion. He came up from his roll, not in a crouch, but fully upright, his weapon held in a two-handed grip, and he fired. His pistol wasn't suppressed. The deafening crack of the unsuppressed 9mm rounds was deafening in the narrow alley, a righteous fury unleashed. The muscle grunted, spinning as two rounds hit his left arm, his own pistol clattering to the stones. "He's armed. Go!" The suit yelled, his professional calm shattered. He grabbed his wounded companion, dragging him back into the shadows. Jake stepped forward and fired again, emptying the magazine, the muzzle flash lighting the alley, the rounds chewing chunks of brick from the wall where they'd hidden. He heard them scrambling away, retreating, the pound of their feet on the pavement as they fled. He didn't pursue. He ejected the empty magazine, his hands shaking, and slammed a fresh one home. He scanned the alley. They were gone. He ran to Max. He fell to his knees, his own pistol forgotten at his side. "Max, no. No, boy. No." The dog's breaths were shallow, wet gasps. The wound on its shoulder was high, but the blood was bright red and pulsing. "Bad." Max whined, its tail trying to move, just a faint twitch. It licked Jake's hand. "No," Jake said, his voice cracking. He ripped his shirt, pressing the fabric to the wound. "You are not dying. Do you hear me? That's an order. You are not dying." He tore his medical kit from his bag, his hands, the steady hands of a soldier, a surgeon, now clumsy with panic. He was losing it. He picked the dog up, all 70 pounds of it, ignoring the searing pain in his own shoulder from the fall. He ran out of the alley, not toward the parking garage, but toward the open street. He ran into the road, screaming at the first car he saw, a terrified couple in a Prius. "Help me!" he yelled, his face a mask of horror. "Please, my dog. My dog, he's been shot." The Prius screeched to a halt, its tires protesting the pavement. The driver, a middle-aged man named Gary, was pale, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep them on the wheel. His wife, Linda, in the passenger seat, turned, her hand to her mouth. "Which way?" Gary stammered, his eyes wide at the bloody man in his back seat. Jake didn't know. He was pressing on the wound, his entire world narrowed to the shallow, wet breaths of the dog in his lap. "Where's the nearest emergency vet?" "Find it!" he roared, his voice breaking with a terror that was completely alien to him. Linda, fumbling with her phone, her voice shaking, read out an address. "Bay Street, it's just a few blocks away. Turn left. Go. Run the light. Just go," Jake commanded. Gary, propelled by the raw desperation in Jake's voice, floored it. The small car surged forward, weaving through traffic, horns blaring. Jake never looked up. He just kept his hands pressed firmly on the makeshift bandage, his shirt now soaked through. "Stay with me, Max," he whispered, his voice broken. "Stay with me, boy. That's an order. You have to try." Max let out a faint, pathetic whine, and licked Jake's hand, that small gesture, a new kind of pain. They screeched to a halt in front of a brightly lit, glass-fronted building, the Savannah Emergency Veterinary Clinic. Jake was out of the car before it had fully stopped. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't look back. He just ran, carrying the 70-pound dog as if it weighed nothing. He burst through the glass doors, a terrifying sight. He was a big man, his face a mask of dried sweat and street grime, his clothes torn and soaked in blood. He was armed. The young receptionist behind the counter, a woman in her 20s with a kind face and purple-streaked hair, gasped, her hand going to the phone. "Please," Jake yelled, and the single word was an open wound. "He's shot, my dog. He's been shot. Help him." The receptionist's training kicked in. She saw the desperation, not the threat. She hit a button on her intercom. Code red, trauma, GSW K9, front. Two vet techs in blue scrubs burst through a set of double doors, pushing a gurney. "Up here," one said, his voice calm and commanding. Jake gently, so gently, laid Max on the gurney. The dog looked small, its magnificent coat matted with blood. "What's his name?" the tech asked, already wheeling him back. "Max. His name is Max." "We need you to fill out." The receptionist began. "Just save him," Jake begged, his voice a raw whisper. "He saved my life. He's family. Please, whatever it costs." The doors swung shut, leaving Jake alone in the bright, sterile waiting room. The silence was deafening. He was suddenly aware of the pistol at his back, the blood on his hands, on his chest. He looked like a monster from the alley. "Sir," the receptionist said gently. You can wait here." Jake nodded, unable to speak. He looked at his hands. They were caked with drying blood. His? No. Max's. The hands of a Navy SEAL, trained to take life, trained to save it. And now they were useless. He'd done all he could. Control was gone. Surrendered to strangers. He sat down in a hard plastic chair, the adrenaline draining away in a rush, leaving a cold, vast emptiness. There was nothing to shoot. No enemy to hunt. No mission, just this terrible, suffocating silence. An hour passed. A woman came in weeping, holding a cat in a carrier. She was processed and taken to the back. Jake sat unmoving. He stared at the linoleum floor. He saw his reflection in the dark glass of the clinic door. The man staring back was someone he didn't recognize. He was broken. He thought of Miller, safe in a hospital in Germany, alive. He thought of his team, of the mission. It all felt distant, like a story about someone else. The only reality was the dog behind those doors, fighting for his life. Jake laced his bloody hands together, a tremor starting in his arms. He bowed his head. He hadn't prayed since he was a boy, since before his mother died. He'd seen too much of the world, too much of what men could do, to believe in a kind, listening presence. His faith was in his training, his weapon, and the man beside him. But his training was useless. His weapon was a cold, heavy weight, and the man beside him was a dog. A dog that had shown him more loyalty and selfless love than he'd ever known. A stray he'd fed for a few days, who hadn't hesitated to take a bullet for him. "Please," Jake whispered, the words stiff, foreign in his throat. Please don't take him. He's all I have. He's a good boy. Please don't take him. He was bargaining with a God he didn't believe in for a life he couldn't save. He realized in that sterile, quiet room that the stray dog had done what Dr. Jacobs, what his commander, what all his training couldn't. Max had breached his walls. It had found the man beneath the soldier. And if that dog died, Jake knew with a cold certainty that the man would die with him. The Reaper would be all that was left. 2 hours. 3. The waiting room doors opened. Jake was on his feet in an instant, his heart seizing. A woman in blue scrubs, a surgical mask hanging around her neck, approached him. She looked utterly exhausted. She was in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent features, dark hair pulled back in a bun, and a voice he didn't immediately recognize. This was Dr. Eva Rustova, the lead surgeon. "You're here for Max," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was firm with a slight Eastern European accent. "Yes. Is he?" Jake couldn't get the words out. "Drive." Rustova looked him up and down, her eyes taking in the blood, the tension, the raw fear in the soldier's eyes. She let out a long, slow breath. "He is a very strong boy," she said, her professional mask softening just a fraction. "And a very, very lucky one." Jake's knees felt weak. He grabbed the back of a chair for balance. "He's alive." "He's alive," she confirmed. He arrested on the table. "We got him back. The bullet, it was a mess. It entered his right shoulder, shattered the scapula, and then it stopped." She held up a small, clear plastic bag. Inside was a flattened piece of metal, the 9mm slug. It was lodged in the muscle surrounding the pericardium, the sac around the heart. It was millimeters from the heart itself. "Millimeters," she repeated, shaking her head. "It nicked the lung, which is why he was having so much trouble breathing. He lost a lot of blood, but the bullet is out. The lung is repaired. He's in critical condition, but he's stable." She finally managed a small, tired smile. "He is an extraordinary fighter, your Max. He wants to live. We have him on fluids and heavy antibiotics. He's not out of the woods. The next 24 hours are crucial. But he's here. Truly, Lieutenant," she said, her eyes meeting his, "he shouldn't be. He is a small miracle." Jake didn't hear the rest. He heard alive and stable and miracle. The immense, crushing weight of the last 3 hours, of the last 3 weeks, lifted all at once. The Reaper, the soldier, the man who never broke, slid down the wall and sat on the floor, burying his face in his hands. The sound that escaped him wasn't a word, but a ragged, choked sob of pure, absolute relief. Jake never left the vet clinic. He sat in the hard plastic chair for 2 days, a strange, blood-stained ghost in the quiet waiting room. He slept in 30-minute increments, jolting awake at every beep from the ICU. The receptionist, the kind woman with the purple-streaked hair, would quietly place a cup of coffee on the table beside him. Dr. Rustova, the surgeon, updated him every 4 hours. "His fever is high, but we're managing it," she'd say, her face weary. "He responded to your voice," she reported. A flicker of a smile. Jake made another call from the waiting room. The first had been to Commander Thompson to report the package successfully delivered. The second was to Dr. Jacobs, the therapist. "I'm not going to make my appointment, Doc," Jake had said, his voice flat. "Are you all right, Jake?" Dr. Jacobs had asked, his voice sharp with concern. I don't know," Jake had admitted. "But I know where I'm supposed to be. I need to be here." "Then that's exactly where you should be," Dr. Jacobs had replied, understanding everything. On the third day, they let him see him. Max was a landscape of bandages and tubes, but his eyes were open. When Jake walked into the small room, the dog's tail, the only part of him not constrained, gave a single, weak thump on the metal table. Jake pulled up a stool, sat, and gently took the dog's paw. He didn't speak for an hour. He just sat. The recovery was slow and painful. After a week, Jake paid the massive medical bill, every cent he had in savings, and took Max home. The apartment, once a sterile, unfeeling box, was transformed. Jake had bought rugs to cover the slick floors so Max wouldn't slip. The expensive new dog bed was placed in the center of the living room, piled with pillows. The apartment, once smelling of nothing, now smelled of medicated shampoo and life. Jake's days, once governed by punishing runs and sterile discipline, were now governed by a new, gentler routine. Every 4 hours, he would gently wake Max to clean his wounds and administer antibiotics. He boiled chicken and rice, hand-feeding the dog when he was too weak to stand. The Reaper, the man made for war, had become a nurse. He found himself talking, his voice a low rumble, filling the silence. "That Doc, Rustava, she's tougher than half the drill sergeants I ever had. You gave those guys a real run for their money, Shadow. They never saw you coming." Max would just listen, his amber eyes never leaving Jake's face, his presence a steady, warm anchor. The news, of course, had traveled fast. The attempted hit on an active duty SEAL on U.S. soil by a high-value target had caused a tactical earthquake. While Jake had been nursing Max, a joint task force, using the intel from Jake's report, the car, the faces, the sheer arrogance of the attack, had descended on Victor Kane's operations. 3 days after the shooting, Commander Thompson had called. "The packages are wrapped," he'd said, his voice grim. "Kane and his entire leadership are in a black hole where they belong. The insider in Baltimore is singing. Broken Chain is officially complete, Lieutenant. Thanks to you, and thanks to him." Now, 3 weeks later, the bandages were off. Max was walking, though with a pronounced limp. The fur on his right shoulder and chest was growing back slowly, revealing a stark, puckered scar, a brutal, star-shaped testament to the bullet that had stopped millimeters from his heart. Jake's apartment was no longer a temporary camp. It was a home. There was a knock on the door. Max, who now associated the door with his person, let out a low, excited bark. "Easy, boy," Jake said, rubbing the dog's head. He opened the door. It wasn't one person. It was 3. Jake froze. The man in the middle was Commander Thompson, a man in his late 50s with a steel-gray crew cut and a face that looked like it was carved from granite. He was in civilian clothes, a simple polo shirt, but he still radiated absolute authority. To his left was Hawk, his team sniper, a quiet man with sharp, observant eyes, and to his right, leaning heavily on a cane, was a young man with a slightly pained grin. It was Miller, the kid from his nightmares. The kid whose career was over. "Sir," Jake said, stunned. "Miller? What? You didn't think we'd come to see the new team mascot?" Miller said, his voice still holding that youthful edge. He looked past Jake. Is that him?" Max limped forward, curious, his head cocked. "Jake," Thompson said, stepping inside, his eyes taking in the scene. The dog bed, the bag of dog food, the man who no longer looked haunted. "This is Max." The team filed in, 3 powerful, dangerous men looking incredibly awkward in the quiet civilian apartment. Miller was the first to move. He slowly, painfully, lowered himself to one knee, wincing. Max, sensing no threat, walked over and sniffed his hand. Miller gently touched the dog's head, his eyes tracing the raw, pink scar. He really did it, didn't he?" Miller whispered, looking up at Jake. "He took the bullet. For you." Jake could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. "Lieutenant," Commander Thompson said, his voice formal. The room went quiet. "We read your after-action report. All of it. The attack, the dog's intervention." Thompson cleared his throat. We don't have a medal for this. Not officially. But the team, we took a vote." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that glinted on a small chain. It wasn't a medal. It was a custom-made dog tag, identical to the ones the team wore. On one side was the SEAL trident. On the other, deeply engraved, was one word, Guardian. Thompson stepped forward. He knelt, a gesture of profound respect, and clipped the tag to Max's collar. It jingled softly. "Welcome to the team, son," Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion. He stood. He looked at Hawk. He looked at Miller. He looked at Jake. "Attention," Thompson commanded. Instinct took over. Jake snapped to attention. So did Hawk and Miller wincing as he straightened his back. They stood there, 3 of the most dangerous soldiers on Earth, at perfect, rigid attention, and they directed their gaze not at Jake, but at the confused, tail-wagging German shepherd. They rendered a perfect, crisp salute. Jake felt his last defenses crumble. The guilt, the anger, the cold isolation, it was all gone, washed away. He was no longer the Reaper, the lone, haunted operator. He was a man standing in his home, surrounded by his family. He broke his stance, stepped forward, and put his hand on Max's head, his fingers tracing the outline of the scar. The evidence of love. The dog leaned into his touch, tail wagging, the new tag jingling. Jake looked at Thompson, at Miller, at the dog who had saved him in every way a soul could be saved. "We're both home, buddy," he whispered. "We're both home."